I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're here to talk about an interesting concept called the P20, and I think we're going to learn more about what it is, why it's interesting as an interesting way to think about some of the global challenges that we see in the world, and perhaps some of the steps that are going to be needed to achieve solving some of the problems associated with the P20, as well as perhaps some of the dilemmas posed by thinking about the P20, at least in terms of what it means in terms of official development assistance or who does what role. So I think we've got some very interesting speakers. I want to particularly thank my friend Judith Randall, who is a co-founder of Development Initiatives. If you don't know Development Initiatives, you should know Development Initiatives. I think they do the most interesting and some of the most relevant data analysis in the developing world, that capturing sort of the totality of various resource flows. I was taken by this at least 5 years ago, and I just think they go from strength to strength. And so if you don't know Development Initiatives, I really encourage you to get to know their products and their work. It's really phenomenal. And this is an initiative of Development Initiatives, an idea of Development Initiatives, sorry, repeating myself. But Judith is a friend, and she's here with her other co-founder, Tony German, who's here as well in the audience. Thank you for being here, Tony. We're also joined by two other very distinguished discussants. Martin Ravalian holds the inaugural Edmund D. Villani Chair of Economics at Georgetown University. He had a past life, a very distinguished career at the World Bank Group. I think it was one of the developers or the developer of the concept of extreme poverty at the World Bank. So I think he's very appropriate that he's here with us. Thank you for being here with us, Martin. And then we have Ambassador Daniel Speckart. He's a former U.S. Ambassador to Greece and Belarus. Since we're talking about the P20, I'm sure you'll have some things to say, given your past lives. But more importantly, you're now the CEO of Lutheran World Relief, so thank you for being here as well. So without further ado, I'm going to first turn the floor over to, I believe, Judith first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Martin after that.
Right, good afternoon everyone, thanks very much for coming along. I'm going to talk very briefly about the P20 because I think it's a very simple concept which we'll then explore much more later on. So you may find the things you want to raise in questions and raise in discussion. But the P20 is about the people in the poorest 20% globally and in every country. So not the countries, but the people spread across countries who are in the poorest and most excluded parts of the population. And we think there is an imperative to focus on those people. If we want to end extreme poverty and we want to include everybody in progress, we have to look at that cohort of the population and see how they're doing. So I'm going to briefly, twisting my neck round so I can see which slide I'm showing you on the screen. That's no problem at all. Talk about the P20. So the P20, if you look at the graph on the left side of the right as you're looking at it, if you look at the graph, you can see the incomes of the P20 and the incomes of the rest of the population globally. The income gap between the rest of the population, the rest of us, and the P20 is continuing to widen. You need to focus both on those parts of the P20 that need to be lifted above the poverty line, but also on the inclusion of the P20 in progress. And the context for all of us over the last few years, over the last decades, will be conversations about pro-poor growth, about broad-based growth, about inclusive growth. We have to get better at measuring this and knowing who is included and who is benefiting and who is not from progress at the national level. So who are the P20? They're 1.4 billion people, a fifth of the world's population. They include everybody who is below the international poverty line, and they include people who are vulnerable to extreme poverty, but they're a fifth of the population. 20% of the world's population, 1% of incomes, 44% of new cases of stunting, 55% of unregistered births. So the burden borne by the P20 is very significant. Addressing many of the issues that are big global issues, we can also address by focusing on this part of the population. But essentially, the P20 is a political idea. If we want to make progress on ending poverty and we want to include people, we have to do two things. We have to know how people are getting better off or not, and we have to know the extent to which they're included in progress. So is that gap widening, or is it narrowing that you saw in the first chart? The P20 is an idea that's applicable both globally and in every country, that we should be looking, whatever situation we're in, we should be looking at the people who are the most excluded from whatever service, whatever business it is that we're trying to provide. So it's applicable within countries and it's applicable globally. Now, if we want to really understand people who are excluded from progress, we have to do much more than simply have data on one dimension of their lives. We have to disaggregate by quintile to start with. Data all has to be disaggregated by quintile so we know who is benefiting and who is not benefiting from different services. It has to be disaggregated by gender. It has to be disaggregated by geography. Within countries, there are huge differences, as we all know, in our own societies and in other societies, between different people in different places, even within relatively small areas. So getting much, much better at understanding the subnational distribution. We already do a lot on this as a community, but understanding the subnational distribution of poverty and disadvantage. But also, we have to look at some of the dimensions that keep people poor. And as a minimum for the SDGs, we should be looking at age and disability as dimensions that we should disaggregate data by. So we get a much more disaggregated picture of people who are left out of progress. But the important thing we think about the P20 is that it provides a vocabulary for talking about these issues with people who will probably not be in this room. So we really need politicians and active public figures and the public to engage around the issues of ending extreme poverty and including the poorest people in progress. There are, as you know, 17 goals. There are 169 targets and there are 230 indicators. That is too much for people to remember, and it's too easy for attention to this difficult, intractable problem of extreme poverty to slip away, to be diluted amongst that. We have to provide and help people with a vocabulary and data and information that helps them to keep their attention focused on the fundamental goal that we're trying to achieve, which is to eradicate extreme poverty and include the poorest people in progress. So the P20 is not aiming to be a precise set of numbers. It's a political idea about trying to get people's attention focused onto who the most excluded parts of the population are and how we can target resources and policy more effectively to reach them. I'm going to rely on my colleague, actually, because otherwise I'm going to have a twisted neck for the afternoon. So if I've missed something out, then would you please say so? So what we at DI are going to do is one particular bit of the P20, apart from the data side, is to focus on three bellwethers. If these three things are going in the right direction, we can think that progress in other areas is likely to be going upwards. If they're going in the wrong direction, if there is no progress, it's very unlikely that we're going to see other areas of improvement. And the three are income. Are people better off? So getting back to the simple questions for a politician who has signed up to the goals or who is committed to improvement. Are people better off or not? Are people better nourished? Nutrition is such a fundamental issue. Nutrition enables people to learn, it enables people to earn, it's a predictor of future poverty, it's an expression of past poverty. Are people better nourished? It's one of the first things people spend their money on if they have a little bit more money, is better food. And the third is civil registration and vital statistics. Are people counted by their government? And this is where I think we're seeing for the future a different dynamic. If we are going to seriously address leaving no one behind, if we're going to make sure that every person is reached, you have to have population data. You have to have better data on the whole population so that you can know who is missing. But also civil registration gives people a legal identity. It enables people to act within their societies. It means that they are known to their government. So these three are the bellwethers that we are looking at, but the P20 can be applied in lots of other concepts. We also need to change the way that we do data. So if we're measuring maternal mortality, under the SDGs, we will have a measurement that's about the prevalence of maternal mortality, the likelihood that there will be a certain level of maternal mortality within a society. It's based on averages. Averages, by definition, don't tell you who's missed out and who's included. So there are 3 dimensions to the measurement of maternal mortality. One is GNI or GDP per capita. One is overall fertility rate, and one is an observed characteristic of the skilled birth attendant, of the attendance of the skilled birth attendant. It does not tell you the women who are missed out of health services. It does not tell you who and where those people are. We need to move to a different way of doing our measurement and a different way of doing our data that gives much better information that enables people to target resources. The Financial Times had a piece last October about poverty in India because our Prime Minister had gone to India, and I think the journalist was going to India for the first time. This is no, it's an incidental piece of information. So in the article, it said that the incomes of the poorest fifth of India's population were growing 3 times as fast as the incomes of the top quintile. Now, many politicians reading that will, or ordinary people reading that, will think, well, that's fine then. That takes care of the problem, because if they're growing 3 times as fast, then they're going to catch up. But because the poorest people are starting from such a low base, that's not necessarily true. We need to have the data that tells you both about what people's status is and whether the gap is widening between those people and the rest of the population. That's the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, between the past and the future, where in the future, in our societies and globally, there is much more attention, not just to the floor, important as it is, but to the extent to which people are included in progress. So this is an idea. This is an idea to help people focus on the poorest parts of whatever part of society they're working with. So within countries, between countries, globally, for businesses. How are the poorest people doing within that part of the population? And what's the data that we need in order to be able to drive progress? That's all I'm going to say. And I think I'm going to leave. I could leave you those inspiring quotes to look at while we talk.
I've got to see that.
Excellent.
I'll try to do it with this one.
Andrew Jackson, very, very fitting, given the moment that we're in. Yes. Excellent.
Okay, thank
Martin.
you very much. Yeah, I like the FDI one. I use it in my book, actually. Can we switch to my clicking? There we go. I'm never going to be able to see this. So look, two messages here. I'm afraid
that's fine.
Neck will not work
yes.
that way. There's been enormous progress against poverty in an absolute sense globally, and we've got to realise that, and enormous progress for P20. This is just facts. The developing world is zooming ahead on poverty reduction, and all credit to the developing world. They did that not primarily through development aid, they did it through good policies. Second, poor countries have relied primarily on economic growth for this task. That's very sort of understandable in some sense, but I think the policy status quo is not enough. If we're going to deal with poverty in a broader way going forward, in all the dimensions of poverty, and as I've long emphasized, we can't just talk about poverty as income or consumption. There's all kinds of things that are missing. As an economist who spends a lot of time trying to measure income and consumption, I can tell you it's missing a lot of things, no matter how good I do it, how well I do it. And that means we're all invariably going to be multidimensional. That doesn't mean we pack all those multiple dimensions into a single index. That's a mistake. We have a dashboard of things that reflect all the aspects of welfare that matter. And when we take that to a policy dialogue, we take it at an appropriate level. If you're talking to a politician in America, it may be the one-digit level. If you're doing an analysis, you go to a final level and you talk about many more dimensions. That's perfectly understandable, I think. Messages going forward. Well, this is just one graph I I made for you of the percentages of the population of the developing world living below various poverty lines. Not just $1 a day, or I've just given you from 50 cents to $2 a day, and from over a 30-year period, and the picture, it's clear. Those lines are going downwards, and that's great news, okay? Obviously, they're not going to be going as rapidly downward at the bottom, and if you go to the very top, they're going to get very flat too, but we're seeing the kind of progress in terms of the incidence of poverty. There's your P20 line. This is calculations I did just this morning, actually, of Y20. Y20 I calculate a lot. What is Y20? But I wanted to make a picture for you. Y20 is the quantile of P20. What's that mean? Well, what's the quantile of 50% of the population? It's the median. What's the quantile of P20? It's the consumption or income level exactly at that percentile, if you like. All right? So given that P20, the 20 will always be with us, we need some measure that shows we can use for monitoring progress. So I'd suggest Y20. The income analogue of P20 is the obvious measure. And here's what Y20 has been doing. I don't have a laser pointer here, but I've given you the graph here of mean consumption for the developing world in dollars a day. 2005 ICP, I haven't updated it yet. Y20 is the consumption of the 20th percentile. A couple of observations here. Over the 30-year period, is that a laser pointer? Great, thanks. Top one, great. Mean consumption, Y20. Look at this change in trajectory to year 2000. Yeah? That's amazing. Developing world in this millennium is zooming ahead. The growth rate is double the historical growth rate. This is fantastic news. Y20 didn't do the same thing. A little bit, not much. Over the 30-year period, the growth rates are the same. In the new millennium, the overall mean is growing at 4.5%, depending on measurement. Let's give me 4 to 4.5% per person per year. Y20 is growing at 3%. So we're seeing divergence, and Judith mentioned this. And this is just another example of it. Okay, what else can I show you? Oops. I can show you that. That's not really useful. How do I go forward here? Right, next.
We may need to hit escape.
All right, this will be fun.
Hit escape.
Escape will do it, and then let's do this. Okay. Now, a couple of challenges. I've said we're making this great progress against absolute poverty, and we can call it extreme poverty, $1.25 a day, 2005 prices, $1.90 a day, 2011 prices, and this is really one of the great achievements of mankind, I think. It's fantastic.
Amen.
And it's not just China, by the way. It was pretty much just China in the old millennium. Now it's the entire developing world. It's sub-Saharan Africa, not all countries, obviously, but we're seeing all regions in the World Bank's classification, all regions of the developing world seeing this kind of progress, and different rates, obviously, but it's not just China. But there are a couple of challenges under the surface here, and I want to flag them. Well, one of them is about dealing with relative poverty. Now, I've always said this: we need kind of two concepts of poverty: an absolute concept, which is a global international line, and a relative concept. The relative concept reflects the ideas of poverty in each society. What it means to be poor in America is not the same as what it means to be poor in India. America's official poverty line is 6 to 8 times higher than India's. Actually, amongst rich countries, the United States has a very low poverty line. Luxembourg, the United States poverty line in 2005 is $13 a person per day. In Luxembourg, it's $43 a person per day. I went to Luxembourg a couple of years ago. I was very curious to see what it's like. But that's a digression. Here's that picture. But what we're focusing on here is the bottom there. This is really going to be fun. Let's see if I can hold all these things together. Juggling these things.
If you want me to, I'll click it if you tell me.
I don't trust you.
Okay.
I trust you, but I'll, if I drop it, I'll give it to you. Here's the Luxembourg-United States comparison. How do we deal with that? Well, we're going to have to think of two bounds. We're going to have to think of a globe. What it means to be poor in the world is that you're neither poor by the common global standard, nor poor by the standards of the country you live in. And that must be our truly global concept of poverty. We can apply that in the entire world, rich world, developing world. We don't need two concepts of poverty as we have now. We have a relative poverty concept in the rich world. We have an absolute poverty concept in the developing world. The two worlds are becoming one world, and there should be one concept of poverty, and I believe this is what it needs to be. If we think about it in those terms, then our progress against poverty doesn't look quite as good because it's somewhere between the bounds. The lower bound is the absolute line, and the upper bound is the relative line. And we're making less progress against relative poverty. And in fact, in terms of numbers of poor, it looks pretty bad, actually. In terms of, this is absolute number, the number of poor, absolutely. Here, numbers of people. Instead of percentage of the population, number of people. And here's our progress against absolute poverty. Well, alongside that progress against absolute poverty, we're seeing rising numbers of relatively poor, but not absolutely poor. That's not a big surprise. When people escape, get above $1.90 a day, they're not like catapulted into $10 a day.
They go to $1.94.
It's
$1.94.
$1.90 actually.
Or $1.91.
$1.90. It's my final offer.
Final offer.
Dan is harking to lots of controversies that I think was best we ignore. We're seeing rising numbers of relatively poor in the world. They're not poor by the common absolute international standard, but they're poor by the standard of the country they live in. Okay, and that's a reality. We've got to face that. Second point, we talk a lot about leave no one behind. This has become a mantra, right? And when I started hearing this, I thought, well, how am I going to measure that? And I started to think, all these quotes that I get, I've got a bunch of them here. This is from the previous Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. The poorest of the world are being left behind. We need to reach out and lift them into our lifeboat. And from Guy Ryder, Director General of the ILO, poverty is not yet defeated. Far too many are being left behind. When I first read those things, I thought, well, gosh, haven't they read my papers? Don't they know that's wrong? But in fact, they may be right, because the way I talk as an economist, the way I talk about poverty isn't necessarily the way other people talk about poverty. I have to recognize that. In fact, when economists talk about poverty, they say things like growth is good for the poor, rising tide lifts all boats, or breakthrough from the bottom. The rhetorics are vastly different, but I've come to believe it's actually because the concept of leave no one behind is a different concept to when we talk about the percentage of people living below a poverty line, or counts of poverty measures, or high distribution sensitive poverty measures. All of that economic stuff about poverty is missing something about whether we leave no one behind. What does it mean to leave no one behind? It means when we see this progress against poverty, we see a rise in the bottom as well. It's leaving no one behind means that the floor is rising. So, question, is that happening? With all that progress against poverty, numbers of poor, are we seeing a rising floor? Well, we are, but boy, it's really not rising fast. This is just a techie way of describing the difference between thinking about poverty in terms of here, these two distributions over time. This is the percentage of population living below various poverty lines. Here we see two distributions, both of which show the same reduction in the poverty rate, but in one, we're seeing the floor staying put, and the other, we're seeing a rising floor. So leave no one behind, your success at leaving no one behind is the right panel. I mean, that means the bottom is rising, the very poorest person is gaining, whereas the left is not the case. Well, which is it in the world today? It's definitely the left. It's not that right panel. Here's what it looks like. That's my estimate of the consumption floor back 30 years for the developing world as a whole. That's the series I already showed you, the overall mean for the developing world. Now, one of the amazing things about statistics is that that line at the bottom there has a significantly positive slope. Huh? Huh? Believe me, and to nerdy stats types in the room, it's got a T ratio of like 10. Yeah? But, give me a break. it hasn't risen much. In fact, the lowest level of living in the world is still at the biological level. And this could, independent of my work, has been estimated to be about 65 cents a day. And the average level of the floor over the last 30 years is 67 cents a day. So the poorest people, despite all this progress, the poorest people in the world are still living at their biological minimum, the minimum to stay alive. The difference is that there are fewer people living near that point. That's our progress. And that is progress. That's huge progress. I'm not for a moment saying we should only focus on the floor, but we can't continue to ignore it, especially if we want to make our poverty measurement connect up with our policy dialogue. The policy dialogue is all about leaving no one behind today, and I agree with that, so we need to bring another measure into the picture. This is what it looks like, another way of thinking about it. Over this 30-year period, let's calculate the absolute gain in consumption, or income, depending on the survey, the absolute gain at each percentile. Not just 20, but let's go through the whole distribution. That's what it looks like. In other words, the absolute gains on this axis, dollars per person per day, absolute gain from 0 at the bottom to $14, $15 at the top. And actually, this is very noisily estimated. It could be, who knows. Our ability to measure the top of the distribution is terrible. But you see the picture. So huge absolute divergence going on in the world. Absolute divergence between the mean and the floor, absolute divergence. Growing economies are seeing rising absolute disparities between the rich and the poor, and that's the reality, that's what's happening. Okay, last part of this is about better measures for policy, but I'm a bit worried about time. Talk a bit about policy? Okay,
Sure.
Great. All right, the way I think about this is there is an optimistic path going forward and there's a pessimistic path. The optimistic path is that if we can maintain that new growth trajectory in the new millennium, the 4+% per year in the developing world, if the developing world can maintain that trajectory without a rise in overall inequality, that's a big proviso, but overall inequality is not rising. It's rising in some places. Relative inequality is rising in some places, not others. But if we can maintain that progress in the growth rates of the developing world going forward, we will reach 3% by 2030. Now, that's very optimistic. That's why I call it the optimistic path, because there are a number of threats to maintaining that progress. There are crises galore. There are all kinds of... I've factored in a certain amount of crisis incidents, but a sequence of crises, we could really be way off track. And that pessimistic trajectory is if we go back to the policies and the growth trajectories of the developing world in the 1980s and 90s. Then we'll be looking at the difference in numbers of poor is about 1 billion people over the next 15 years, depending on which of those worlds you live, which of those paths you follow. The much better policies of the new millennium or the worst policies of the 80s and 90s. And that certainly includes global trade. How to get to the optimistic path? Well, this is my wish list for pro-poor growth. Develop human physical assets of poor people, make markets work better for them, the rhetoric of market-friendly policies has to be market-friendly policies for poor people. And that's a different policy agenda most of the time. Removing biases, undoing the damage that governments do. Half the time they're the problem. Investing in local public goods in poor areas, relaxing restrictions on migration within and between countries, foster labour absorption from the urban economies, build small and medium-sized towns. That's my personal list. I'll emphasise that even the optimistic path will leave 1 billion people who are in that other group, relatively poor. We'll have lifted 1 billion people out of our extreme absolute poverty, but we'll still have 1 billion people who are poor by the standards of the country they live in. And that's real poverty, that's still there, and that's going to be there if we're successful in this optimistic target. How do we do about that? Well, basically there's no option but redistributive interventions. If we can't get that space for more redistributive interventions, it's not going to happen. Right? Now, we've got to be smart about that. Another thing that's happened in the new millennium is we're much smarter at redistribution. The countries that are doing it effectively are doing it very well. Across the entire developing world, we're seeing all kinds of experiments now in social protection, direct interventions against poverty. We're seeing some great stuff. We're seeing failures too. All of that leads me to this point. We've got 1 billion people in extreme poverty. We've got 1 billion people receiving social safety nets today. The problem is they don't much intersect. And if you look at the incidence across countries, this is giving you the safety net coverage across all countries. There's a picture I compiled from a database at the World Bank, but it's public access. On the vertical axis, the safety net coverage, the percentage of the population that's covered by these new safety nets that we're seeing all over the developing world. And on the horizontal axis, GDP per capita. And there are 2 points about this. One, that the poorer countries poorer countries tend to be worse at redistribution in favour of their poor. One of the ironies of anti-poverty policy is it's harder to fight poverty in poor places, and that's why they stay poor in many cases. But we're seeing a variance in progress. Some countries, look at the variance. Look how many poor countries are doing quite well. And there's lessons to be learnt. And most of the dialogue now, the policy dialogue in development, is between developing countries. Constraints, we have to recognise those constraints, because too often policymakers are too overly ambitious. A lot of those failed policies are because you've ignored the constraints on direct intervention. I don't for a moment believe that direct intervention alone will do it. We have to combine it with pro-poor growth, and we have to be smart direct intervention. But we can do it, but we have to recognise the constraints on information, incentives, budgets, and political constraints. Going forward, 6 recommendations. The first, I think, is obvious. Policies must be tailored to the realities of the setting. Policymakers have got to get realistic. That means we've got to be able to tell them, sorry, it's just not going to happen that way, given their constraints. And part of that dialogue is about good policy making, is about learning what those constraints are in specific settings. Incentives are hugely important. I mean, this is an economist talking, so I'd be out of business if that wasn't the case. But they also get exaggerated. Critics of direct interventions exaggerate incentive effects like crazy. We have to look at them realistically, objectively, scientifically, and recognise that they're there. By all means, perfect targeting with 100% marginal tax rates is dumb, as this country realised in the 1980s, and many countries are started realising now. Recommendation 2, tap local information, but build effective local states. The development community for a while was retreating from the state, relying on civil society organisations. I think the relying on civil society organisations is hugely important for delivering certain kinds of services, but we can't retreat from building state capacity. We're going to need both of those things going hand in hand. Third, focus on poverty reduction, not targeting. This word targeting is overused. Some people say direct interventions and redistributive interventions are all about targeting. It's not. It's about poverty reduction. Sometimes more targeting can be a threat to sustained poverty reduction. Politically, because of incentive effects, fine targeting involves very high marginal tax rates on poor people, much higher than any rich person would ever tolerate. And it's not a good idea. Improve the protection promotion trade-off. Here's where the smart policy comes into it. Policies which both protect and promote people out of poverty, combining the two. All kinds of good examples of that. Conditional cash transfers have been hugely successful in that respect. Some criticisms, some concerns, issues about how important the conditions really are. A great policy discussion there, but that's something that is really on the agenda. And getting smarter workfare programs too is part of that. Monitoring and evaluation, I think this is obvious. But this last one, if I leave you with it, lessons learned from mistakes. This is one of the frustrations here. I spend half my time working on evaluation of policies and teaching evaluation. It's really frustrating. If you spend so much time on the science of knowing whether things work, if governments keep sticking with policies that don't work. it's amazing. The capture by participant capture is part of it. The political economy, the bureaucratic inertias, learning from mistakes is one of the most important things going forward. I love this. I'll leave you with this final point from an NGO called Give Well, which I really know very little about. I'm not anyway connected to Give Well, and is anybody from here from Give Well? I don't know, but anyway. Give Well has a page on their website devoted to acknowledging their own mistakes. And the very first, this is great, the very first is they wish they'd hired a PhD economist so that they could really evaluate what they're doing and learn better about what their mistakes are. And I wish every citizen of the world would ask all of their governments to do exactly the same. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ambassador Speckart, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I wanted you to, you're at Lutheran World Relief, you were in government. So I know that this is, the issue of the P20 is something that you must be thinking about on a daily basis in your day job.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for that, Dan. And in fact, I'll be a lot less comprehensive than Martin and perhaps less statistically significant in my comments, but I thought I could do two things. One is give you a little insight from a practitioner organization that works at the grassroots on the ground, how it looks from sort of the bottom, recognizing that we are just one piece of a much larger piece of policies, organizations, political bodies, and others that have to be energized to address this issue. And then I also probably can bring some comments to bear as it relates to roughly 30 years in government, working for 5 different administrations in terms of what the political environment is now in the United States and how it might connect to this. I'd like to thank Development Initiatives for putting this forward. I think it's a very elegant way of trying to take the next step of what was the Sustainable Development Goals that really went in depth as to what needs to happen to address ending extreme poverty, but is not really accessible beyond the experts. I spend probably more of my time traveling the United States than I do overseas, because about 80% of our funding comes from private individuals and organizations. And so I spend a lot of time listening to them about what motivates them and what gets them excited about giving to address poverty in the world. For us, when I talk to them about our strategy, it's very much in line with what Judith had laid out for the P20 of focusing on a few key things rather than a large number of targets. She mentioned income, and she mentioned nutrition, and she mentioned civil registration. For us, we equally have focused on income and nutrition, and that's because what we see in terms of our work on the ground is that this is really about empowerment of people. It's not a project to be implemented in the sense that if we do A, B, and C, poverty is eliminated. It's about helping people realize their potential in their difficult situations. An example of that was a year ago. I was in Bihar, India. It's one of the poorest places in the world, roughly 100 million people. If it was its own country, it would be one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet it sits within this emerging economic tiger, and it gets lost and left behind. And so we have a program there working with the Dalits. In past generations, they were known as the untouchables, the lowest caste there. And we're working with the women, which are sort of at the bottom of the lowest caste. And what we have been doing is helping those women be more successful in their small subsistence plots and growing enough food to provide food security for their families and enough to sell in a local market. And it starts just with some basic knowledge transfer and support at a community level. And what you find is that they move from growing just sorghum or millet or rice, one crop kind of thing, to growing vegetables, which are actually income producing crops for them that they can sell in local markets. They very quickly solve their food security problem. And they have a little money left over. And in India, and actually everywhere else I've traveled, when I ask them, what do you do when you start having a little extra income? They say, I spend it on education first, and then second, health. So if you start addressing those income questions, you are empowering them then to make the decisions as to how they take care of their family. Doesn't mean that other organizations focusing on health and water and education aren't needed, because these systemic problems are so huge in these places. But it is really a powerful empowerment tool to focus on income. Second, when she mentioned nutrition, I was excited about that because one of the things that we learned is that, well, you think if you teach everybody how they can successfully grow more diversified crops and vegetables and nutritious foods, that'll take care of the nutrition problem with children. But in fact, those are actually high income producing crops. And so many of these families will keep feeding their children a diet of rice until they understand the connection between the nutrition and the food that's related to their children being successful in life and in education and elsewhere if they get a nutritious diet. So you do need to mention and focus on nutrition as well and not income by itself. And last, registration. I think you mentioned it briefly, but if the people aren't counted, if they aren't even recognized, they're not going to be successful in the environments in which they operate. For me, that empowerment thing was really so important in my education as to what's happening in these parts of the world. With this group of women we have been working with in Bihar, we talked about the program and the success they had had, but they really wanted to tell me what they've been doing recently. And what they had been doing recently is that this group of Dalits, the women at the bottom of the caste system, at the bottom of society, had organized themselves because they weren't getting their food ration cards, essentially the same as food stamps in the United States. And they went off and had a sit-in at the local mayor's office, created a big attention flurry. The notion that these Dalits are, as a group, coming to demand this right, brought it to the local press. All of a sudden noticed this. It started becoming a headline, and the next thing you know, they got their ration cards. They were ecstatic. I mean, they're sitting on probably generations, probably a millennial, of not having seen an example of empowerment of how they could take these problems into their own hands and start solving them. That becomes the push and the demand on the system to address their problems. So I like where you're headed, Judith, and development initiatives on the P20 to make it simple, to focus on a few things, key things that empower people. The second thing I wanted to mention is to how we make this the why of why it's important to be able to communicate this in a way that is more powerful to people. I know everybody in this room probably thinks it's just the right thing to do. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I think as I travel around the country, most Americans think the same thing. You know, they want to see poverty eliminated. But when I ask them, would you like to give more of your taxes going to foreign aid, that's where all of a sudden I start getting very mixed answers and primarily negative answers. They think foreign aid doesn't work. They think taxpayer dollars should be better spent at home, and a whole other host of reasons why they wouldn't rather have their taxes raised to do more of this or even necessarily take a larger percent of our budget. But that doesn't mean they aren't open to other kinds of arguments as to why this is important. And I want to just offer a few that have worked when I've talked around the country. The first is this issue of migration. It's an important issue here in the United States. It's an important issue globally, with more people displaced and refugees than ever in our history, over 60 million people. And people understand quickly the challenges that people are on the move, oftentimes for either economic reasons or because of conflict. And when it's economic reasons, oftentimes these people at the very bottom are the first ones that have to do something if they're starving. Or if they can't get their basic needs met, they start moving. And while most of them don't find their way to Europe, they find their way actually to other countries, developing countries, who are even less capable and able to support and sustain them. So when we talk about a world that we all want to live in, a stable world, a world with fewer problems and challenges, we need a world where there's less migration, and people understand that. We at LWR work in Central America, and I can tell you how important it is to work on the problems there if you don't want to see the problems here. Second, security. This is a little bit more trickier sometimes because a lot of the literature doesn't support a very one-to-one direct link between the poorest people create the insecurity problems in the world. They're too busy just trying to find their next meal. But I do believe there is a secondary effect in here. The people that are creating the challenges in the world in security are the ones who feel the world is unjust, the system is rigged, it's unfair, and the people are being left behind at the very bottom because of a slighted system. And to some extent, what we saw with Martin's view is those people at the very bottom, in absolute terms, while more are coming out, there's some that are just completely stuck there. And when you talked about the social safety nets, it kind of highlighted the fact that there's a political system that's working against some of these people. So for us, we need to think about this as a security issue as well. I'm actually kind of interested in seeing Secretary Tillerson take the helm at State Department, because I think he'll understand this issue of security as it relates to development. Leading Exxon, I'm sure they spent lots of resources trying to make sure the communities and areas they were working in were stable and stayed stable, and supported that through development. I don't think they were doing it for philanthropy. They were doing it for shareholder value. But the argument was, if we're going to invest billions of dollars here, we want stable communities. The last argument I would make is economics. And I think that's primarily, right now, given what's going on in the United States political system, a very important one. Judith shared with me earlier that this P20 represents roughly $1 trillion of consumption. And that with a small increase in that, you could get 160 million a year, I think, is that right?
Billion, yeah.
160 billion, excuse me, that's how large these numbers are, 160 billion a year. Those are consumers, and there are consumers that spend every extra dollar they get because they need something. 100% goes into consumption. This is the way you grow the world economy over time. These are markets that are hugely untapped and are going to be the future markets of this country. They turn into U.S. jobs when we start thinking about the U.S.'s ability to connect the Walmarts of the world to reach into these developing countries or other U.S. businesses is really a powerful one. And while that may not sound like the moral argument to make, it's one you might want to be trying to make right now in the political environment you're facing, those of us who really care about the situation of the poorest 20. So great start, Judith, and appreciate what Development Initiatives is doing in this area.
Thank you. Let me ask one question to the panel. Thank you, Martin, for some of those statistics about social safety. That's very enlightening. Could I ask each of you, in the context of what is the role of, is there a role for the international community, whether it's the World Bank or global NGOs, in upper middle income countries regarding the P20? What is our role? What is our role, given that there is a large number of, certainly the poorest of the poor, many of them live in middle income countries, India and China, but also in other countries as well. Whereas at the same time, perhaps there are challenges or dilemmas around whether or not, certainly it's certainly solving the problem of the poorest of the poor in those countries is not necessarily going to be a question of ODA. So what role is there for the international community? And if it's not us, what role, who are the sorts of actors that are going to make the sort of cases to, in essence, change policies that are gonna, the policies are gonna have to be changed? Is it, if it's not us, who's it gonna be? Let me start with you, Judith.
Well, I think, first of all, we have got a new allocation of responsibility, if you like, because certainly under the global goals, they are mutual responsibilities for everyone, and not only for governments either. So there is a sense in which all people need to engage in this endeavour to ensure nobody is left behind. Companies, individuals, governments. I think that we can get hung up talking a bit too much about ODA, which is a tiny part of the resources. It is really important because you can target it on particular places and particular people. But if we are serious about the overcoming extreme poverty, we have to look at subpopulations within countries, because that is where poverty is. Looking at whole countries, except for some, is not going to enable us to reach, when I say us, I'm going to differentiate that in a minute, to reach the people who are left out of progress. So who is the us then? So part of it is an international responsibility, in my view. We have international mechanisms and we need to think about how those apply more broadly. But actually there are all of these other things going on. So I know Jennifer Maddens is here, for instance. Issues around disability and solidarity between disability organisations and disability groups themselves taking actions which may deal with some of the issues about people being left behind across countries. There's a role for that. There's a role for corporate activities. We need to look much more broadly at the whole picture of resources. But I also think there's a big role for information. So if you don't know who is poor, where they are, or indeed how poor and excluded they are, if we don't have the data on who is missing, then it's very, very difficult to focus the resources. And secondly, the issues around what you do about it is the next question. But if we are concerned about security, or if we're concerned about health security, which is an easy issue to understand, if you're in India, over half of the TB cases are concentrated in the poorest 20% of the population. If you're concerned about TB in India, and you're concerned about TB globally, then you may be useful for you to know that, and that may act as an incentive for different people to act. So I think we need to look at it much more broadly in terms of mutual responsibilities and the different parts that people can play once they have the information about who is being left behind.
Let me just take advantage of the fact that you have the floor for a second and just push on the issue of data.
Yeah.
There's been a push within the conversation around the SDGs of a revolution in data.
Yep.
I think this fits in this.
Yep.
Could you just spend just a minute more on what more needs to be done on data? And is it a question of a little bit more money? Is it a question of political will in developing countries? And what can be done specifically on data? Because it seems to me that is a very open door. If you want to achieve this agenda, this is certainly one of the things you're going to have to do. And we were both in South Africa last month at the World Data Forum, and it was a technocratic conversation. I'd love your answer to, I know you'll take it a step above the technocratic.
Or a step below the technocratic.
Or a step below the technocratic.
Whichever way you look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the data revolution, terrific term, has lots of elements which empower us, whoever us is a very broad group of people, us to achieve more. So we shouldn't be reliant on national averages, because actually we can access data in all sorts of different and disaggregated ways to understand in much more real time who is included and who is excluded from progress. We have many sources of data which we can use. A key issue is how we actually join them up and make them usable. So if you, I'm reminded of this because there's somebody in the audience who was involved in this from a very early stage. If you take a parallel example of the International Aid Transparency Initiative, to which most donors are signed up, and over 500 aid-providing foundations and organizations are signed up. The problem they were trying to solve was that a Ministry of Education, dependent on their budget on aid for their budget for maybe 50% of their budget, didn't know about the resources coming in. How do you spend your budget effectively if you don't know all the other resources coming in? So the International Aid Transparency Initiative is a tool for enabling all of that information to be brought together and joined up, so you don't have to go to Norway and to US and to Gates and everybody else in order to find this information. It can come to you. If you're a hard-pressed official trying to make sure disabled children are included in school in northern Uganda, it's very difficult to get the information, but it's there. It's on notice boards, it's in budget presets, it's on websites, it's on information gathered in local surveys. How do you get that information and join it up so that you know it in order to get to the people that you need to get to? More systematically, on the data revolution, we need to change our attitudes. So you need to have minimum standards for disaggregated data. If you look at these 230 indicators, they are sporadic.
230 indicators of
the SDGs.
Of the SDGs.
They are, so...
That's a full-time job for a whole lot of people.
Yeah, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
So you will have disability here, you'll have ethnicity there, you will have all sorts of different terms. We need a minimum set of standards about how we disaggregate. And our view is that an absolute minimum set is quintile geography, gender, age, and disability. That you need to have that as built into your data system so that you know who is likely to be missed out of progress. But the fundamental building block, and I thought that there was really interesting stuff on this at the World Data Forum coming from national statistical offices, Rwanda, for instance. The fundamental building block is civil registration and vital statistics, knowing who your population is, birth registration, death registration as an absolute minimum. So in the P20, 2/3 of births unregistered, 2 children in 3, their birth is not registered. Opening a bank account, ensuring that you have custody, engaging in a contract. All of those things are enabled, not wholly enabled, by civil registration and vital statistics. So this is a really fundamental, this is data about people. This isn't prevalence, this isn't averages, this is trying to get data so that you can target resources. The other side of it is, you have this fantastic resource of the engine of the data revolution, of the new technologies, of the access to information, of the ability to join up. So there isn't the excuse. We have the data. Or we could have the data.
We could have the
data.
data.
Join it up, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Martin.
Okay, just very briefly, because I think there's lots of people here who've got something to say, but I think, first we have to separate the ethical from the policy position here, and I think that those two get confounded a lot in development policy debates, particularly in this country, I find. But the ethical position, well, we're really very lucky to live in a rich and free country. It may not be obvious all the time, but a lot of people in the world are not so lucky. So our position as a global citizen, that must be, I think, empathy with people everywhere, no matter where they live. And poverty is something we care a lot about as people, as global citizens. The ethics is clear, and there's a moral philosophical debate on this, and there's different positions and nuances on it, but that's certainly, I think, it was a widely accepted position. I don't think many people would disagree with that. But don't confound that with the policies. So yes, I'd say there's a huge involvement a huge role for rich countries in dealing with poverty problems in middle-income countries. But it probably shouldn't be about development aid at all. It's about knowledge. And our development dialogue in middle-income countries should be about that. And that's not just us giving them knowledge, them learning from them as well, but facilitating that exchange, which is key. The knowledge foundation for policy is absolutely key here. Knowing what works, what doesn't, what the good principles are for policy in specific circumstances, no cookie-cutter approaches. All of the things I touched on, and I talk a lot about in my book, The Economics of Poverty. But that's the role. In countries which have very limited capacity for doing much at all, we're going to be there with money as well, I would hope. And I think it will be in our interest and in their interest, and that's defensible. But this idea that we fight poverty in the world as a whole using ODA is a joke. I mean, what China? China has done more for poverty reduction globally than any country in human history. The poverty reduction in China is phenomenal, right? And they didn't do it with development aid. Actually, I think the World Bank helped them quite a lot on some of the knowledge stuff, and credit to the bank. And other players in the development community too. But it was policy reforms. Initially, it was the reforms were undoing the damage of the past reforms, right? That got them 10 years of progress against poverty, and then we got a whole set of new policies which catapulted 500 to 600 million people out of extreme poverty. Now that's an amazing achievement, but they did it with good homegrown policies, including a culture of evidence-based policy making. Deng Xiaoping was an evidence-based policy wonk, and partly a reaction to the Cultural Revolution, the excesses of that. But he was all about learn from what works and what doesn't, experiment in local provinces and try to figure out what works. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have randomized control trials or non-experimental methods of fancy econometrics. That's developed quite a lot, but they had the culture of evidence-based policy making, and that was key.
I would just add, your question is a good one, but I think it pushes us to really rethink the way more strategically we think about the world. A recent book that I'll put a plug in that I read was The Seventh Sense, Joshua Cooper Ramo, The Seventh Sense, and he's challenging us to just think about the role of networks in the world and how it's replacing old systems, and in our case, nation states, diplomats, ambassadors, things like that. The reality is the role of an ambassador, the role of the organizations that were set up after World War II to kind of organize the world order. needs to be rethought in the way information, communications, and relationships are being developed around the world. So for me, it's less about their middle income, so what's the role of the United States, and more, what are the networks that are going to be built between people here and around the world and the poorest 20% in India and the poorest 20% in the United States connecting to people around the world. And I guess that's the second point I'd make, because I really like what Martin was talking about, the absolute and the relative. By bringing in the relative, one of the things that I liked about the SDGs was that it wasn't rich versus poor. It was a all of us issue related to how you deal with poverty in your countries, and that is just as equally important of a conversation for the United States. So you can have this conversation with India in a mutually respectful way, and sharing information and experience like Martin was talking about.
So while I have you, let me just put a couple questions to you, Ambassador Speckhard. So one is, who did policymakers in India listen to? Who do when you're on the ground? Is it empowered people because it's a democracy? Is it the press? What moves Indian policymakers when you, in some of the places where you're working, say in Bihar?
It's power politics, just like it is here in the United States. And the people, the poorest 20, don't have much power, so they're not really that interesting in the power politics situation. That being said, there are a lot of really impressive people in government who want to solve these problems. And what they're listening to are the Martins of the world. They are looking for technical knowledge that will help them solve these problems. My nervousness is the problem that we've had in the past with development approaches is that it's a technical fix. It's a political issue as much as a technical issue. And so that when you come in and you get advice from the World Bank or somebody else, it may not work nicely in the context of, they can tell you what policies would work or what technical fixes would work, but they don't have the understanding of the local political dynamics that recreate that. And so I think it's going to require changing the political dynamic, and that's why there is a role for these networks, because there are people and there are organizations like mine and others who, just by helping people lift themselves up in the economic system, all of a sudden start having political power.
Let me just push just a little bit further. You were ambassador to Greece and Belarus. So Greece is a NATO ally, and Belarus is kind of a bad guy, if you ask me. But I mean, it depends on the day. I have a friend who ran for president there and was a political prisoner. I've hosted him here, and so I'm not a big fan of the current dictator there. Yeah. I'm sure you're not either. So let's take both of those countries as examples. Right? So Greece is a EU member, has kind of a starter aid program, has some, lied on their statistics and got some problems that we're all aware of. I'd be curious about what kind of influence does who did the Greek government, when you were there, listen to? Did they listen to the Americans? Did they listen to the EU? Did they listen to IMF? Did they listen to, I don't know, who do the Greek policymakers listen to? That'd be the first question. Then the second is Belarus, which is a more Greece a democracy, and then Belarus, which is a faux democracy, is basically a dictatorship. Very bad actor, Russian client state, kind of middle income, right? Going back to my middle income thing. So who's, when you talk to the Voldemort, I'm not going to mention his name, but that guy, or you talk to his ministers, who do you listen to? Do you listen to the World Bank? Do you listen to EBRD? Do you listen to the IMF? Who moves them? What moves him to do something, let's say the morally right thing to do? So I'd be curious about both of those cases.
Yeah, great question. I mean, in Greece, they may tell you different things, but first and foremost, it's the political elites, which are the business elites inside of Greece. The moneyed class is the one who essentially controls the media, and
in my next
the
life,
money and the media controls the political system.
Right. I want to be a Greek shipping magnate in my next life.
Less those, because those guys kind of do all their money in a different way. They're basically working on the global economy. It's more those focused on the Greek system itself. But they get themselves in a situation where they need external resources, then they start listening very carefully to the European Union and the IMF. And they also have always listened to the United States. It's a love-hate relationship between the Greeks and the United
And so
States.
it's because of the Greek diaspora in this country?
Greek diaspora, there's a lot of commonality between our countries and our peoples, but at the same time, there's a lot of long history there of challenges. Belarus is a little bit different, obviously. I mean, this is a unique situation. You find every now and then these autocratic leaders who are truly in their own world. And their world is a different world than the rest of us live in, and you think you can deal with them sort of in a rational, diplomatic, or economic way with the right kind of levers here. But it doesn't work.
So you can't bring in technocrats in and just explain to them that they're wrong?
That doesn't work, and pressure oftentimes doesn't work, as you see in North Korea or Belarus or somewhere else, because they have the system so tightly controlled by that point in time that it's not about that kind of popularity. I do think the long-term solution, though, for those is, again, these networks, which is you need to expand the understanding in the population of what they're missing and what needs to happen for the full realization of that country's potential and the people's potential. Both of those countries, though, are examples for everybody in the world about risks and challenges to our democracy. The United States can't relax on its 200 years here. The reality is our country is at risk as well if the system starts to decay. And that's what happened in Greece. It never really developed in Belarus, but you need to have vibrant, full, participatory, economically participatory countries for you to be successful.
Thank you. Judith, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I just think it was very interesting, and I was just thinking about it as you were saying. I mean, in Britain, the effect of the Brexit vote was for a lot of us to think we didn't know that our own country, that people had voted in a way that surprised many people, certainly surprised the sort of metropolitan chattering classes, and I think a lot of the issues are because information is incomplete. So prior to 2 or 3 years ago, one of the big themes of conversation was how fantastically fast African countries were growing. And it's true. National averages for growth in many African countries were really impressive. But it was also true that poverty persisted and even increased at the same time within those countries. So when you're having that dialogue, if you don't have the complete picture, if you only have the national average picture, you are not going to be able to engage on those issues. And it's the same with resources. If you're just going in looking at the lens of ODA, you're not looking at all the opportunities there are to address these issues. So.
Thank you. All right, there are a lot of thoughtful people here. We're going to do this World Bank style, so I'm going to bunch a whole bunch of questions together. This gentleman here, this gentleman here, other folks. Can't be all dudes, so this lady here, this lady here, okay?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you're first, with the red tie. Yeah. Then you, and then this woman with the glasses, and this woman here.
I'm Eric Leaf. I'm with the State Department. I have to say, though, in addition to all those other qualities, he's a secret finance geek in his
I thought you were
former
going to say
life.
he's a secret agent.
We were so you talk about hands on the secret data. There we go. But Judith, you and I have been having some of these discussions for it's going on 20 years now, and IETI came to be during this time frame, and what I wanted to just poke a little bit about was more about this issue of subnational interaction. When I see these charts up here and we're talking about countries, you and I were starting down this road at a time when I had a boss who was saying, in regards to health, that we had to be worried much more about what was going on in West Bengal than in Lesotho.
Yeah.
And he was saying that in terms not only of relative population and relative burden, but in terms of the authorities that were delegated for dealing with issues in terms of health and data ownership and everything that you've been talking about. How do you how do the two of you feel about the quality, the relative improvement of quality of data in that context when you're talking about poverty and when you're talking about the authority of, let's say, subnational entities to deal with poverty issues? And secondly, along that frame, let's assume that the quality of the data has improved. Does that misrepresent the progress that's been made? In fact, is it a more level, improvement, if you will, because we're capturing better data now than we did before?
Okay, great.
And I guess the only other point I'd raise is thinking of what we've talked about so many times over the years is different decision, totally on with what's being said here about ODA, but ODA can be a galvanizer. And I've got the issue burned in my brain of this current incoming administration being all about public-private partnerships and leveraging other sources of energy and funding. And
Great.
We've been there.
Great, thank you. Let's have this, how about this woman over here?
Do you believe that women
Name and-
Oh, sorry. Arian Jenkins from the Hunger Project. Do you believe women empowerment is the first thing that people should look at in order to solve poverty within the communities that are being overlooked?
Thank you. This woman in the glasses. There's lots of women with glasses, but that woman in the glasses.
I'm Shivangi. I'm a human rights professional from India, and I had this question about, you talk about the importance of registration of births, and I've worked with, and we all know that world over, undocumented immigrants are one of the poorest populations, and I've worked with Dalits, and I've worked with Bangladeshi immigrants in Assam. The total population is estimated to be roughly more than the entire population of Belgium. So, but this population does not receive any support. At least the Dalits have their own political parties, although with flaws, but at least there's a structure. This population is completely on their own without government support, without native support. So will the initiative intervene independent of government support or lies with government support for populations of undocumented immigrants? Are there any plans like that?
Okay. This gentleman back here.
Thank you. Fred Karimamusoka. I'm a retiree of the World Bank. I'm also from Uganda. I'm just struck by the P20 being a political initiative. And going through the whole discussion, especially in many developing countries which are tyrants, like Belarus, for example, where you have dictators, going through the whole discussion, not hearing the word corruption, and how that impacts on the bottom P20, and how willing are the politicians, autocrats or dictators, are they willing to actually address poverty? Because we know poor people are easy to govern. And sometimes it looks like we look at dictators as just want to stay in power. But they're motivated by the fact that, the more poor people you have, or more dissatisfied people you have, they're the only ones who can solve their problem. So going through the whole discussion without mentioning the word corruption as its impact is amazing to me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Judith, I'll let you start first.
Okay, I'll pick two, if
Pick
that's
two.
all right. So on the question of subnational data and the things that can be done now to get better subnational data, I think there are two things going on. I'm just glancing at Alex here because he might possibly put something very sexy up on the screen in a minute with subnational data. We'll see. But the things that you can do both technologically and because there are more data sources. But what I actually wanted to pick up on that is the power of the subnational data in policy dialogue. So if you're having a discussion in the capital of a country about poverty issues or about deprivation, then the ability to actually pick out places and identify the differences between, let's say, Kampala and Karamoja is really significant because it's something you can understand and get hold of. And it's something that is can be addressed then because most people's responsibilities rest on some sort of geographical area. So it's not just that you need the data in order to target resources and policy, but it actually brings to people's attention in a very intuitive way issues around where progress is being made and where progress isn't being made. And on the P20, what we would like to move to is not a description of how many of the P20 there are in different countries globally or what the P20 status is like within a country, but looking at administrative districts, looking at locations where you have concentrations often of intractable poverty. And if DFID, for instance, have had a policy not only of leave no one behind, but of reaching those furthest left behind first. That means they are interested in looking at, within Nigeria, not just what regions of Nigeria are particularly excluded from progress, but within those regions, which people are excluded from progress, within those groups, which religions. So, I mean, they've cascaded down to identify the people on whom they think they should target their scarce resources. So I think this has real policy traction. It isn't just about knowing it, it's that it's meaningful to people when you're having the discussion. And the other issue I wanted to pick up was the comment about migrants, and it harks back to data, the woman who's the human rights professional from India. It harks back to what I was trying to get at, not very successfully at the end of the last conversation, about completeness of the data. So at the launch of the Global Nutrition Report in Thailand, there were two sets of data on malnutrition in Thailand, one from the government and one from UNICEF, its multi-indicator cluster survey. And there was a massive difference between those two sets of data. So you ask what the difference is. The government only records data on Thai citizens. It doesn't record data on migrants. So the picture you have of malnutrition within Thailand is completely different depending on which lens you're looking at the data from. And this is why we go back to the issue of population data and civil registration. You have to know who's missing if you're serious about who's left behind.
Good. Martin.
Okay, data. Data's improved enormously, and a lot of the progress we've made against poverty is due to better data, no question. Certainly not the only thing, and I worry just as much about the existing data being translated into policy and effective action. But there's been huge improvements. I'm not sure why we're complaining so much about the data. I think we have to know what there is, and I'm not sure everybody here knows what data exist. That said, there's a ton of data problems, and I could catalogue them for the next month. As a researcher, I see them all the time, and I'm complaining about them all the time, and we're trying to improve data. I think if there's one thing that I think is still lacking, it's the data dialogue is never taken to a high enough level in the policy dialogue. And this has been a source of great frustration. I think Shada Badi's here, and is running the data group in the World Bank for a few years, yeah? Yeah. A few, and 30. Anyway, I'm sure she'll back me up on this, that it's just so frustrating to get, even in the World Bank, get your country director to talk about data problems with the finance minister. Just raise the profile of these issues. So I think that's important. But actually we've made huge progress, and I think we're a little bit behind the reality there. Erica's comment, is women's empowerment the magic bullet? No, it's not. But there is no magic bullet. Some places women's empowerment is going to be hugely important. Other places, many other things are more important. And one of the things we learn, you've been in development as long as I have, virtually my entire professional life. You just learn there are no magic bullets, and we just got to keep a broad set of things in play about what might be the problem, the high priority issues in a particular context. Could be subnational, could be national, and that would certainly be on the menu. And if it's not on the menu, you've got a problem in your policy analysis. The third, on registration of births, I agree, this has been a chronic problem. The Rohingya in Myanmar, I teach about them, and one of the most left behind and persecuted groups in the world, and that there's a whole lot of specific discussion about that, and certainly in Assam as well, we've got a bunch of issues there. And nothing much to add. The word corruption wasn't used, but it was there a lot of the time. And that's one of the things about that word corruption. I really don't like that word. But when I talk about state capacity, when I talk about improving the ability of government to do stuff, when I talk about building civil society organizations side by side with stronger local states, you can read that as loosely as code for some corruption problems that may be lurking there. But I really don't like the word. I think it gets misused.
Judith, you had a...
I just wanted to really endorse the point about the data and how much data there is. But also to say that I think there's a big political economy issue of which has two dimensions. One is we don't have political champions for data. We don't have people seeing the value of data like they see the value of money. We can throw it away and do another survey. So we need to change that orientation so that data is seen as this seen as this huge asset. And we need to change the incentives, because at the moment the incentives are to do ever more complex analyses of existing sources of data, crudely speaking. Actually, the incentives need to be to get better quality data in the first place. And to do that, you have to reveal the quality of what's there now. So I think those bits of political economy, particularly the political leadership and championing of data as a transformative resource, that's what we need to see active politicians championing.
I just want to end on that. And one of the remarkable things that's happened in the last 15 years, and as an economist I see this, the econ PhD students all over the world are generating data. They're not, we used to be, when I was in graduate school, you took data as exogenous, it was given to you. And you use that data the way you just described it. That world's gone. Actually, everybody's involved in producing better data, working with statistics officers, getting questions into questionnaires, doing field work. It's a sea change.
It's true.
That's notable.
I would add to that, I had a little short span of a couple of years working with a Silicon Valley data company. And what that taught me was this kind of problem, for instance, it is a hard problem if we're going to try to approach this kind of from a government perspective, that we need a big project, we're going to collect this massive database, and then it's going to feed the system. I think the way we need to think about where the world is headed is these databases will be generated. They won't be perfect, they won't meet all of what we need. But if you get enough of those databases and then cross-reference and then pull in enough information, you will start getting even a more accurate picture than you would have had you sent out Census Bureau folks doing this stuff. So for me, it's exciting to think about that future where you have who owns cell phones, who's buying what and where. I know that makes some people nervous in terms of privacy, but if the personal data is pulled out of it, it's enormously powerful for these kind of questions related to P20. And I think that's probably going to be how we're going to solve this problem as opposed to a government-centric problem. On women, at least from a practitioner point of view, put your money into the women. I think the evidence at the grassroots level shows the productivity is higher and the results are better for the family. That doesn't mean exclusively, but we have a bias towards that because of the results that are shown on the ground. Wanted to mention in terms of these underrepresented groups, I think there's two things there I wanted to highlight. One is that these problems are political in some sense, that we really have to figure out how to help support getting political power into the hands of those people. And in my mind, you have to create an understanding through this new network world that that's really the sign of a civilization. You can't be a civilized country and leave one group behind and say you're civilized, including here in the United States. And so I think that's the way to kind of approach that. Corruption, central to the challenges that we face, even just as a development organization, but central to the whole question of whether you're going to be successful on this. I guess what I would highlight there for the United States is we need to get back to the idea that we need to be we have to have a value-based approach to our foreign policy. And I would highlight my experience in Belarus that you were talking about there. It was really hard to be ambassador to Belarus and say, you need to live by these principles. Democracy is key, and until you do that, you're not going to have a relationship with us. and then have other strategic allies that had just as autocratic systems, just as tough as human rights and something else. And somehow we were able, as a country, to kind of live in that bifurcated world and not see what they were seeing in the rest of the world. And it leaves us exposed. It leaves us not being impactful in what we're trying to do. And it's not just the moral principle what I'm talking about here. It's the effectiveness of it. The notion that in this new networked world, it's not going to be the ambassador or the State Department or others that are shaping this world. It's going to be all of you networking out there. And what you want is for the rest of the world to want to live in open societies that allow for productive and economic growth and individual freedoms, because that's a world that we all want to be a part of. That'll happen through a network world.
Thank you. Good. We're running out of time, but Judith, I want to give you the last words. Why don't you just a couple thoughts you might have.
I'm not very often lost for words, actually. It's a rare experience for me. So I've worked in this area for most of my life. And just relating this back to the environment in Britain and the US and who's actually going to pick this agenda up and do something about it. First of all, I think that the commitments made last year, 2015 rather, on the SDGs were really different. There is something very different about focusing on leaving no one behind and eradicating poverty to simply reducing it. So I'm going to give an example that relates to Martin. As an organisation, we've had for years the end of absolute poverty, the eradication of poverty. And we used to say it sort of behind our hands because we thought people would say how stupid we were to think you could eradicate poverty. And then Martin produced this paper which said you could get, I think by 2022, down to X percent, 2%, 3%. Change the environment. Because then you're talking about something feasible, timetableable, plannable. And if you don't do it, it's a choice. So that seems to me a huge political opportunity, and we have to make sure that we don't miss it. That is exactly why we have developed the P20 Initiative, because we need to keep as much of that political capital, as much of that energy devoted to achieving results for that part of the population as we possibly can. So there's an opportunity that we have to take advantage of. But the other is that there is real potential to achieve change relatively quickly, using the energy of the data revolution, using the capacities that we have, and focused on achieving change. So I think that we should be optimistic. I think we should think about what can be achieved. And the last thing I was going to say harks back to what Daniel was saying about people's going around the country and talking to people and what their attitude is to ending poverty, and differentiating that from their attitude to an official aid programme, which may be quite different. If you look at British society, if you look at any town, you will find a great number of links. You'll find individuals, schools, companies, all sorts of institutions who've got some sort of engagement with poorer parts of the world or with particular people who are left out of progress. That is who we are. That is who society is, certainly in Britain, and I suspect here in the States. And we shouldn't allow the debate to move away from recognising that people do feel that ensuring no one is left behind, is the sort of person they want to be. So I think we have a real opportunity, but we'll miss it if we make it too complicated. That's why we're doing what we're doing as our little bit of contribution, to try and keep all of our attention focused on simple things. Are people better off? Are they better nourished? Are they known by their government? There's lots of other things we could focus on too, but moving in that direction in lots of different ways.
Great. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists.